Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you're joining. Welcome to another episode of Intercultural Conversations. And actually, today's episode is extremely important to me, and there are many reasons why, of course. Actually, food is a very, very integral part of my life. Food is a very integral part of my family's life. A lot of the significant moments in our family we actually remember by the type of food that was prepared on that day. So clearly, it's extremely important to us. And when I started reading Masala Lab, which is a book by the author who's going to be joining us today, it kind of justified all the emotions that I felt while eating certain preparations by Amma, Ajji, or whoever was preparing food that day. I must say it removed a little bit of the romanticism from the memories, but it was so interesting. And as an interculturalist, I think I understood the importance of cuisines, importance of food for countries and for cultures is when I was studying to be an interculturalist actually, and people from different cultures would be discussing many things. And the one thing that kind of binded us all of us together is when we were discussing food. There is just such a sense of pride. It's an expression of pride discussing your cuisine and the food of your country, and it's almost an expression of patriotism. So you could have been from the sketchiest country in the world with an obnoxious leader making questionable decisions, but when we spoke about food, it would be like a thin veil of something that brought us together. And that's why I really wanted to have this discussion, and I think I have the perfect guest today to have this discussion. We are going to be joined by Krish Ashok. Krish, as I mentioned and also mentioned in the promos, is the author of Masala Lab, which is a book that explores the scientific way of Indian cooking. But more importantly, he's here is because if you've been following Krish, he posts amazing educational content about food and cuisines on his social media. And he also discusses how history and culture and economics and politics actually affects cuisines and local cuisines of countries as well. And that's going to be the context of our discussion today. So without further ado, I'm going to add Krish on the live so that I won't go on a rant about the emotional eating problems. I've sent you an invite, Krish. Hello.
Hey, hello.
Hi, Krish.
Am I audible clearly? Just give me 1 second.
It's not very loud.
Okay, what about now? Is it better?
Yes, I think you'll have to get the mouthpiece a bit closer to you.
Is this better? Otherwise, I'll just take the Bluetooth off and speak straight into the. Is this better now?
I think that.
Yeah, let me do
Yes.
that. I think let me just speak straight into the. Yeah.
Yes, that would be better if there is no Bluetooth.
Yeah, is that much better now?
Perfect.
All right, super.
That's it. Yes. Krish, I know I missed out a bit more of your introduction. In your own words, you're neither a chef, neither a scientist, but you're a software engineer based in Chennai who has a true passion for cooking, Indian cooking specifically, and food. And you've written such an interesting and informative book that I've had the pleasure of reading, but not completely. And I'm so happy that you're here today and to share your knowledge with us. And also, one more thing, you're also a musician, if I'm not wrong. You play the guitar really well. So, Krish, I'm going to dive right into it. So, we're going to start with the book, yes? So, in Masala Lab, you'd actually mentioned that Indian cooking is more like an art form. And I completely understand that because, terms like aapke haathon mein jadoo hai or that your hands have magic while you're cooking is something so far off from it being related to science. And you I'm sure that you found the need that there has to be a much more scientific explanation to Indian cooking. But I want to know, and we'd all love to know, what was the inspiration, or was it rather a trigger than an inspiration that inspired you to write Masala Lab? We can't hear you, Krish. Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. So it isn't a pandemic era online event without the expression "you're on mute" being heard at least once. So it's on an auspicious note we begin that. So actually, I want to start with something that you said. Haath mein jadoo sort of thing, right? So one of the things that has always irked me as someone who is on the intersection of arts and the sciences, as in I grew up essentially growing up to be largely an artist. I mean, I was supposed to be a professional musician, a violinist till my mid-20s. And then my parents said, you know what, I think, that's it's going to be a bit of a struggle. So let's take the easy way out. You do engineering and sort of do that as a hobby. So like typical Desi parents, right? But I think so. One of the things that's always irked me when it came to cooking, my interest in cooking happened pretty early in my teens, and my mother sort of taught me to cook because she had a job and she got promoted, and it meant that somebody had to. The only kid in the house who would manage to perhaps not cause an LPG explosion was essentially chosen to be trained in this, and so my interest in cooking began quite early, and again, being an engineer and then going abroad for the first time, it increased my interest in. So my obsession, again, as someone who's a software engineer, essentially meant that software engineers are, or at the very least, good software engineers are obsessed with the documentation. They're obsessed with this idea that knowledge cannot belong to only the smart ones or someone who can innately figure things out. Knowledge has to be representable in a way that someone who knows absolutely nothing can work their way up that by simply reading the documentation. I mean, that's a very central principle of good software engineering. And it's central to IT in general, because I think you've got to be able to take kids straight out of college who have absolutely no skills and turn them into people who can manage complex technological systems, and that requires your documentation and your knowledge management to be top-notch, right? And so when you say something like you have this haath mein jadoo and all of that stuff, it has always irked me, because I think it's interesting because art, first and foremost, is built on craft. Right? So the part that we don't say out loud is that the jadoo in the heart doesn't come without 10,000 hours of back-breaking labor in the kitchen, right? It doesn't come just like that, right? So in a sense that you can't be an artist without putting in that hard work of being a craftsperson first, and being a good craftsperson requires mentorship, it requires training, it requires documentation, and so on. And India has a very, very uncomfortable and tricky history with knowledge and education. And the idea of passing down knowledge has never been a very universal thing. It's always been that you will pass on knowledge only to people of your community, your caste, and that sort of thing. And there's always been this sort of a person who makes leather will pass down that knowledge only to someone in his family, and so on, right? And it sort of applies to everything. It's always been the case in India, right? So even if you take the example of music, you can see the art in something like, say, an Ilayaraja's composition, right? You can see the art in the fact that he chose this particular 6 minor chord in this particular song. That's like, oh, how on earth did he make that choice? To someone who's into music, that seems like a moment of artistic genius, right? But it makes no sense without the fact that he had like 100 of the most insanely well-trained, hardworking musicians in that orchestra who were able to hit every note precisely, exactly as he intended. And it's all of that craft that goes into making that art, right? And I think the second aspect of this is that if you take cooking itself, right? I want to take a couple of examples. I want to take something like, say, a crochet or knitting, embroidery, for example. And if you generally see over history, painting is art. Embroidery is a lesser art. Requires pretty much the same kind of skill. And in fact, takes more time, takes more effort. But again, you will see over history that things that were considered womanly arts. Art also has hierarchies, right? So so singing is superior to dancing, because dancing is something women do, but singing is something that men do, apparently, right? And so you'll find that again, cooking is considered cooking as an art, in a sense, has that sort of vicious perpetration of this idea that one, it's not a craft, and therefore I'm going to not recognize the fact that the women have to do this unpaid labor in the kitchen for decades without any kind of recognition before they get to the point where they say, oh, their hands have magic, right? And you completely don't recognize the hard work, but you're just recognizing the art. I think that part, I think, felt to me that it has to be sort of challenged, right? In the sense that, one is that this idea that only women can be good at it is a pernicious way of, shall we just say, a modernist weasel way of saying only women need to cook in the kitchen. I think, our grandfather's generation was just more openly blunt about it. Women's place is in the kitchen. But the more modern way of saying it is that, oh, I don't have the skills, my wife has the skills to cook. I think is modern way of saying, exactly. It's a more modernist repackaging of that same sort of patriarchy.
Yes.
But I think so in a sense that so therefore I said, look, you have to document the craft. And unfortunately, when I looked at writing about Indian food, so you have to recognize that we know what the Sumerians cooked for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right down to the recipe, 5,000 years ago. Why? Right. Because they wrote things down. They had cuneiform and they wrote things down, right? Indians are notorious for not writing anything down.
It's not oral culture, it's passed down orally.
Yeah, it's passed on orally. Yeah. And then you add to that fact, one is that access to literacy and knowledge is only restricted to one community for almost most of history. And even within that, it's only 1/2 of the population, right? My great grandmother did not go to school, right? So my grandmother was the first one to go to school, maybe went till like class 4 or 5, right? Or class 6 or 7 before she got married and so on. And so that's how far, that's how recent that we've had an opportunity to even document things like recipes. There are very few recipe books in Indian history. Very, very few, barring what the Mughal kitchens documented, and maybe one book by the Chalukya emperor of the 12th century. And obviously Ayurvedic sort of remedies and so on. Cooking wise, there is literally, right, for all the Nala, the history of Nala, etc. There's no book of Nala's recipes, for instance, right? And in a sense, I think if you think about how writing about Indian cooking is therefore come about, one, it's through the Orientalist view of, what are these savages cooking? Let us write about it. And the first generation of people writing about Indian cooking were British people, and people writing in English, right, about Indian in cooking and so on, because they took a taste to it, and then you have now things like chicken tikka masala, which were invented in entirely in the UK, right, and now they're being served in Indian restaurants and so on. And so a lot of this initial level of documentation is just basically recipes, right? And in a sense, I think you have to give credit to someone like a Tarla Dalal, because I think more than anyone else, she's the unrecognized, the queen, if you will, of essentially getting documentation about Indian food outside of just the celebrity chefs and the people cooking in Mughal kitchens and people cooking in restaurants, right? Basically, homemakers sending in their recipes, be it Oriya, Gujarati, Maharashtrian, and so on. People would just send in emails, and that tarladalal.com needs to be a museum of Indian cooking. We don't recognize it, but nobody did more to really capture the collective wisdom of our grandmothers and mothers and so on than Tarladalal. And again, now, when you really think about it, knowledge representation also has a maturity model, right? So you start off in cooking, you start off with recipes, but ultimately you've got to get to the point where the recipes have to have a standardized language. They have to have things that are not easy to confuse and so on. And so if you read 2 recipes today, they often use terms that individually they mean different things to the people writing them. And so that is in a sense where science comes in, because science again is nothing more. And again, it's terrible that people somehow think that there's a certain arrogance associated with science. Science is nothing more than a language of precision to describe something, and it can be tested, and it can be invalidated or validated by anyone reading it, right? So in that sense, I think the language of science is essentially a way to create a common vocabulary of the knowledge that our mothers and grandmothers already had, right? This is not to say, you guys are wrong. This is the scientific way to cook, I think is the wrong way to think about it. And I kind of call it out in the first chapter of my book, which is that nothing here is new. And this is a book that explains why your grandmother's a great cook and why her heuristics check out, right? Your grandmother may not have been able to explain thermodynamics, heat transfer, Maillard reaction, and so on. But now we have the tools, we have the knowledge, and so their heuristics have actually worked out. So that, in a sense, and because nobody had done it before, it just ended up being a good, lucky bit of market research before I wrote the book. So that's how the book came to me.
Book came into it. Oh, wow. There's so much. There's so much to discuss that there as well, because actually the reason why I didn't end up finishing the book was because my mother was reading it as well. And when you said about, basically backing what our grandmothers and mothers have been doing for years and kind of justifying it. And even when my mother, she read the book, I think there is somewhere you mentioned about adding a pinch of salt to either paisam or kheer.
Yes.
And she's been doing it for the longest time, right? And the fact that she could read that in a book and see that, hey, there is a reason for it that I was doing it. It was not only out of intuition, but there's something that's backing it, I think also gave her, I think there was a sense of pride there.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. So I think often we sometimes, there are India sort of swings between two extremes. One of pseudoscience and somehow mistrusting formal scientific authority on the one hand. On the other hand, completely sort of demonizing any kind of traditional or tacit wisdom because it's not in the language of science. And I think, and nowhere is this intersection,
all the time.
Right? Nowhere else is this intersection more clear than in cooking. Because we all have to eat twice or thrice a day, and you don't need the knowledge of science to be able to to be a fantastic cook. You just need practice. You need to be able to realize which of those heuristics works, and if those heuristics don't work, figure out your own heuristics and so on. It is a scientific discipline, except that we've not considered it, right? We've not documented it that way.
Would you think practice would make one the best chef? So if I were to practice cooking, absolutely. You believe in that?
Yeah, absolutely, right? That is true of music, it's true of painting, it's true of anything else, and it's true of cooking too. And again, what is interesting is that you paint, you also want sort of external validation of some kind to say, is it good? Are you really improving? Some neutral way, rather than you yourself sort of saying, yeah, I'm getting better, and so on. But
need validation of human beings for sure, yeah.
With cooking, you have an opportunity to have an audience of yourself for the rest of your life. And so really, there's one of the easiest things to get better at is to cook.
So there is hope for me then. There is hope there. And you also actually mentioned that the British have been documenting at least the Indian cooking before, and it's just interesting because there's this one of the posts that I saw that you had shared, and this was about upma.
Yes,
and upma I'm a South Indian, so upma for me for the longest time had been a very ancient South Indian preparation that I had extreme pride in, because the upma shira combination cannot beat anything, in my opinion. And then I read your post that upma was something that was semolina, the thing that is prepared to make, used to prepare upma, was something that was propagated by the British.
Yes.
During the World War II, because rice from the south of India was sent to the troops, right, fighting in the World War II. And that kind of shook me a bit, firstly because I didn't know this, secondly because it kind of shook my identity also as a South Indian. So could you just expand probably on that example, or probably share some other examples as well wherein historical episodes have affected a region's cuisine or the dietary preferences too?
Now, I think 80% of what urban India eats today, it wasn't eaten 150 years ago. So for all the idea about Ayurveda and ancient tradition and so on, there's really, there is little that we eat today in an urban setting that wasn't introduced by colonial powers in the last 150 years in any meaningful sense. Tomatoes, chilies, potatoes, and so on. So gourds, brinjal are native, right? And everything else either came as a result of the Columbian exchange, which is crops that came from the Americas, which is chilies, potatoes, tomatoes, certain kinds of pumpkins and so on. On the other hand, and beans, your rajma sort of beans and so on. And then you also have European vegetables like cabbage and cauliflower and beans and carrot, all of which were introduced by the British. Tomatoes were not cultivated in any kind of scale before the 1890s. So that's really, really recent. And so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So in white, there were pockets where obviously tomatoes were used. Tomatoes were introduced by the Portuguese in Goa 300-400 years ago, along with chilies and so on. They didn't become like large scale agriculture till the 1880s or 90s. Right? Meaning that if you were in a city, you couldn't just get tomatoes anytime like we do now. And so on. So history plays a huge role, and very short-term history plays such a huge role in our diets, and we all have short memory, right? So the upma example is obviously one. World War II, they needed to convince South Indians to eat wheat because rice was a shortage and so on. So there are many such episodes of colonial powers changing. I think there's a fantastic book, The Hungry Empire, which is essentially a history of how the British Empire changed eating habits around the world. All the way from sugar and slavery and tobacco and coffee and spices back in the day, right? So it was the British and Dutch fight over nutmeg and mace and cloves that resulted in New York becoming a British possession, Manhattan becoming a British possession, and so on. So I mean, so within India, right? I think the most infamous example I can think of how diets were changed is the switch away from millets as being the staple in Bihar and Bengal to rice and wheat, and in some cases corn. Okay. Now the reason was that before tea was cultivated in India, the British were importing tea from China, and obviously the Chinese wanted nothing other than gold and silver, and they did not want to barter anything, and this was causing a balance of payments crisis. There's too much foreign exchange going into China with only in exchange for tea. So I think what's interesting is that the British then, obviously being the British, they wanted to figure out a way by which they could get some good into China that the Chinese absolutely want, and even if the government or the emperor does not allow it, but the people will still want it, and in exchange they can get the gold and silver that they can then use to buy tea. And it turns out that commodity was opium. The best opium in the world grew in Bihar and Bengal. And so they essentially, and the problem was that the opium cultivation clashed with the millet cultivation window, right? And so what happened is, so they had to convince, again, there's a caste angle here. They had to convince the Dalit laborers, forget the zamindars, but they needed labor, right? To come and work in the opium fields as opposed to work in the millet and rice fields. And they paid 5 to 6 times as much, making it a very easy choice, right? I mean, why would they work for some, caste zamindar when you could work in a East India Company farm and, make 5 times the money and not face the caste insults that you would otherwise do. So it's all very complicated. And then what ended up happening is that millet consumption just went down. Many of these became opium fields. They relied entirely on rice and wheat. And once there was a famine and the rice and wheat crop failed, the famines became worse, right? So in a sense, you can actually trace a direct correlation from the growth of opium in Bihar and Bengal to the Bengal famine almost 70 or 80 years later, right? So in a sense that I think, and in that while the switch to more processed, wheat and rice also had health implications. They are vitamin deficient. Millets are far more healthier and also hardier and more environmentally sustainable, require less water, far more less likely to fail, because every 100 kilometers a different millet is grown, right? And so I think there's so many examples like this. Pav bhaji is another fantastic example, a lightweight example, because I think pav bhaji is fantastic because the pav is Portuguese. The potato is South American. The tomato and capsicum and chilies are Mexican. The beans and the cauliflower and the carrots are all European. Pav Bhaji has 0 ingredients that are of Indian origin. And yet it's impossible to argue that it's not an Indian dish, because I think, in a sense, that it's really good. So there's always been, the absorption of ideas from everywhere, right? So the ingredients have never mattered at all, right? It speaks to the whole point about authenticity, which we can get into, saying that this has never been about ingredients at all, right? If you think about food that was eaten 500-600 years ago, you wouldn't recognize it as food. You wouldn't like the taste either, because what is Indian food without chilies and without tomatoes and without many of these other really ingredients that make the central flavor profile?
Yes, and I mean, talking about all of the ingredients coming in from different places and the diversity of it, or diversity on our plates that's generally there in the Indian culture as well. I mean, I usually don't look at India as one whole country. I look at it more like the European Union. I look at Republic of India the same way, where the moment you cross the border, it's a completely different culture, completely different language, and of course, completely different cuisines as well. And then, talking about that.
So if somebody crosses the Wagah border from Amritsar and into Lahore, little's going to change. But from Punjab, if you just cross down to in the south, it's just a completely alien culture in terms of food and everything. Right?
That was going to be my next question for you, actually. So you've mentioned before that there is no good tasting cuisine and there is no bad tasting cuisine. Right? That doesn't exist. And whether or not you like a particular cuisine or a dish doesn't say anything about the sophistication of your palate. It just is a result of your own nostalgia, your own memories, and the kind of food that you grew up with. So my question for you is, there are many people who from different cities, different places, they come within India itself, they come to Bombay and they go to a South Indian restaurant, they order a paneer makhan wala, and then they end up complaining about the food in Bombay being so bad. And this usually happens. And Delhi and Bombay, we always have this healthy rivalry. And food is one thing that is always debated about. So what do you have to say to people who, have a certain idea about the sophistication of their palate?
I mean, I think it's a very simple thing. Food is never good or bad. It's only unfamiliar. It's only familiar or unfamiliar. And familiarity and unfamiliarity are just deeply personal experiences. So in the sense that nobody can actually be objective about food. You can at best say that I grew up in Delhi. For example, I did, right? And so I grew up eating, paneer makhan wala and butter chicken in Delhi. And so therefore my idea of what it ought to taste like is based on the flavor profiles of how it's made there, right? So that's all there is. And at the moment I come somewhere else, and slightly differently. For instance, in general, food in Bombay tends to be slightly spicier because that's how people in Bombay like it. People in Delhi do not deal with high levels of heat and so on, right? And likewise, people in Chennai may not use certain, like for example, black cardamom is not a commonly used spice at all. But it is very central to Punjabi cooking and so on, right? So in a sense, I think it's only about familiarity or unfamiliarity, nothing more. But our brains are wired in such a way that it makes it seem like I ought to make a value judgment here. This is a good dosa, this is a bad dosa. Right? Your brain is constantly forcing you to do that. But it takes a lot of effort to step back and say, you know what, actually, this is just my limited flavor memories forcing me to judge this way. Right? And again, let's be fair, you do not have to enjoy a paneer makhan wala made in, say, served in a South Indian wedding in Chennai with spices that you might not recognize. Maybe they use more fennel, maybe they use more garlic, maybe they use curry leaves as part of that, right? And you do not have to like it, right? As long as you're willing to empathize that there's 100 people who are enjoying that, right? And you saying that this is shitty food doesn't really help anyone. You're welcome to not. Why would you, yuck somebody else's yum, right? So to use a
why would you yuck somebody else's yum? Yeah, that should be people's life motto, actually. Yeah, and that's the empathy and that's the sensitivity, not only to understanding cuisines but people's culture as well, because it's just so very integrated. And there's this other very interesting thing that you mentioned, and it's there in your Instagram bio as well, that you have a healthy disregard for something that's called authentic food. And I must say, I have been that way also, in a sense that I've lived in Paris, and I would go and eat at Indian restaurants there and would complain about the authenticity of dosa that's cooked there.
Yeah.
And generally, I feel that we are a culture that's moving into that importance of authenticity. Everything has to be authentic. This material, these diamonds, the origin of our culture, the explanation to it has to be authentic, and there's no the nuances don't exist anymore. Everything has to be extremely to the origin and authentic.
Yeah.
I mean, some of which is good, some of which is bad. But why do you have, this kind of an aversion to authenticity and food?
I think for starters, I think if you travel widely and especially as a child, if you live in multiple cities, you're far more likely to lose this idea of authenticity sooner rather than later, right? And in a sense, also, I'll empathize and say that if you're a grad student going to the US and you go to this fancy hipster place in California, and a bunch of white people serving you dosa and explaining that it's a crepe made from rice and lentils, I can understand why you would roll your eyes and say, "Come on, you're just appropriating someone else's culture and making money out of it." So, in that limited context of appropriation and so on, you can make an argument about authenticity, geographical authenticity, and I guess lived experiences and so on, right? But the vast majority of the context of how authenticity is used otherwise is so. Let me take another word to really explain why I have a problem with the word authentic. Let's take the word natural. Now, there's a fantastic book by Alan Levinovitz, who's a professor of theology, right? And he's written a book called Natural, and basically says that the word natural is one of the most meaningless words in history, okay? In the sense that there is actually no objective, rational definition of the word natural, right? In that in every context that someone has used natural in the last 600, 700 years, it's always been a value judgment meant to exclude something else or to discriminate against something else, right? Natural, man and woman marrying is natural. Everything is unnatural, right? White people are natural and black people are unnatural, or that this is natural and something else is unnatural. So there is really, so for example, what does natural food mean? Just to take an example, right? Is rice natural? You can make the argument that nothing we eat is actually natural because the rice plant cannot exist in wild nature by itself. If you go plant a rice plant anywhere in the jungle, it will die in 2 days. It can survive only with pesticides and human care because that we have artificially selected for all the things that we want, but nothing that the plant can actually survive in the wild. Right? So so somebody can make the case that nothing we eat is actually natural. It's all been genetically modified by human beings for our consumption. Right? There is nothing natural about the dogs that we have as company dogs because they would not be able to survive in the wild because they are completely dependent on us. We have chosen docility, we have chosen poor eyesight, we have chosen all the things that make them not wolves and want to eat us, when they will not eat us even when they're starving, right? So that is how, brain damage we've made them. And so there's nothing natural. So the word natural has no meaning at all. If anything, we use it always to judge and to discriminate. And I would argue that, and this is probably controversial, that authentic is the same thing when it comes to food. It is not a term that actually describes anything. It is a term that has its roots in exclusion, right? Authentic. So in almost every situation, you will find authentic rasam has no garlic is not a term of authenticity. It's a term of caste supremacy that says that, the Brahmin way of making rasam is superior to how other people who use garlic, and it's not for me.
I never
sambar does not have fennel. it's again a caste stuff. So and I think it's very but when people say it, it's like, oh, of course I don't mean it in the sense of caste pride and things like that. No, again, it's the same thing, right? The modernist representation of how a lot of the older biases work is that we use new weasel words to again enact those same behaviors, and I think authenticity in food is very similar to that, right?
That is so true. Yes, we also relate the word traditional to authenticity as well.
Yes.
Tradition that's passed on by people who could have been flawed,
Yeah.
which is passed down, doesn't make it authentic. It just makes it traditional or old.
Essentially, you're saying that when you say something is authentic, you are actually saying what you're actually communicating is all the rest of these things are not authentic. That is what you're communicating. You're not actually communicating anything intrinsically useful about whatever it is that you are talking about, right? See, because at the end of the day, somehow paneer makhanwala made a certain way, which you call authentic, and paneer makhanwala made another way. Maybe let's say uses another oil, right? Not ghee. Maybe it's using coconut oil because it's in Kerala, and they use curry leaves, right? And they use fennel and garlic and maybe red chilies, right? Because they like it more spicy. Made a paneer makhanwala there, right? What does saying authentic in this context? What value judgment is actually? Is it good in any way? Is that somehow bad? Is that somehow unhealthy? Is it not? Are people who are eating that somehow not enjoying it? Are there not people who can enjoy that, right? So that's why I'm saying that when you use the term authentic, you are not describing anything good about what is it that you're talking about. You're literally saying everything other than this is bad.
Yes.
Right, and in the context of food, that's meaningless. No two houses have the same recipe of sambar or biryani or dal or anything, right? Every house, So I, for example, I once posted a video of many years ago, and I think as far as I know, my mother and her grandmother, they have this sort of they like rasam with ginger. Okay. Ginger. Apparently, I did not know till I encountered a lot of people that. Oh, by the way, there are a lot of people who don't put ginger in their rasam. Okay. And how I thought your mother made authentic food. How is she putting ginger in rasam? Was something that somebody actually asked me. At that point, I'm like, what? How does it really make a difference? Right. So the point about authenticity, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, authenticity are like opinions. There are no right or wrong opinions. You may just agree or disagree.
When people say authentic, do they mean original version? Yeah, there again, I think it's very easy. Define original, right? So when somebody says this is authentic sambar, right? You're talking about a dish that has a Maharashtrian name, made with ingredients most of which are foreign. To sambar powder is made from chilies which are from Mexico, tomatoes which are from Mexico, and so many of these ingredients. So how far back do you have to go, right? Actually no, right? Now, for example, every year, there's sort of like a religious festival that my family does. My parents do that. Remember their ancestors, and on that day they cook food that's very unique, by the way. It's basically they cook with ingredients that are pre-Columbian exchange in nature, meaning that there are no chilies, there are no tomatoes, there's nothing in that meal that would have existed, after maybe 1200 or 1300 or something. So therefore, the flavor profile is entirely ginger and pepper based. Okay, and it's quite intense, right? All that pepper and ginger is just going to completely burn your throat all through, and it's very one-dimensional. And anybody eating that today will be like, I can't eat this daily. Fine, once a year, it's a nice fancy meal. So how far do you have to go back to consider something?
Yeah.
Like that? And why is one version of that original somehow more important than something else?
Yeah. Yes, that's so true. Yes, and talking about differences in opinions and differences in versions, I come to a much more risky question for you. Yes. I think, and everybody knows about this and everybody reads about this, I think in our country at the moment, dietary preferences are being politicized. Right? And I just can't believe I was at what you would consider a relatively premium restaurant in Bombay, and they had written beef with asterisk marks. But they didn't write pork with asterisk marks. Just let me make that clear as well. And even when there are social media influencers who are actually fearful of
writing beef, and again they post it with their asterisk marks. How do you feel about dietary preferences being politicized in a country which is largely diverse?
I think one of the remarkable things about this part of the world is somehow the ability for so many things that are diametrically opposite to each other and contradicting each other to kind of coexist. I wouldn't say coexist peacefully, largely peacefully, but of course with lots of violence, periods of violence in between for many reasons. We've had partition, we've had invasions from the northwest, we've had inter invasions in the Cholas invading the Chalukyas and destroying temples, and people don't like to hear about that, but they did. Right? But the thing is that food. In this part of the world, I want to make a couple of observations. Again, it might be borderline controversial, but anyway, so this is a topic where we can sort of so this is a part of the world where the only part of the world where the dietary preferences of the majority are framed in a language that describes what the minority does not eat. Meaning that nowhere else in the world do we use the term non-vegetarian. Okay, right? So this is unique to the subcontinent. Right? It's again because the people with privilege are far more likely to be vegetarian, and somehow we've normalized the use of vegetarian, non-vegetarian. But non-vegetarian is the majority. It really didn't strike me till I attended a wedding in Trivandrum where the buffet had counters. They had vegetarian and they said regular. And the first time it struck me that, hey, okay, because the default there is regular. So they said, I can sort of imagine maybe they would have thought about, should I call it normal? Then that would presume that it's abnormal. They don't want to go there. So they said regular vegetarian. Right? That seems like but again, so that's one. The second interesting thing is that a social system like caste and obviously all of the other religious sort of challenges, the diversity of religions we've had, from Buddhism to Jainism to different cults of Hinduism, the Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Tantric Hinduism, and culminating. And then you had Islam come in and Christianity, and all of this sort of melting pot. You have to realize that food is very central to the identity of every single one of these groups at multiple levels. So food is unfortunately a fantastic way to crystallize a specific narrow identity and prevent you from crossing over. Because I think it's one of the hardest things to do in India if you grew up eating one kind of food, is to go to somebody else's house that serves an entirely different kind of food and share a meal with them, right? Because the moment you can do that, we'd have far fewer instances of violence and so on. Right? I, on a lighter note, like for example, my parents, the first time they went to Calcutta, simply could not eat at the home of a Bengali family because their medium of cooking was mustard oil, and mustard oil, as far as they're concerned, is the most pungent thing on the planet. And I mean, we don't have to talk about meat, no meat, and fish and all of that. Even just
the oil itself.
Just the choice of fats, the choice of like for example, I have people in my family who cannot eat food that uses cinnamon, fennel, and a few spices that for some reason they've considered to be unacceptable, right? Not sattvic, if you will, right? And they've never eaten it, so it's too intense for them, right? And so in a sense, I think so we have Jains that say nothing under the ground, and we have different people. So people who only eat chicken, people will eat chicken and mutton but not pork. Some people will eat pork and other things but not certain things. And then you'll have Muslims who will not eat pork, and then Hindus who will not eat beef. So the number of these variations essentially mean that I think the controversial statement that I wanted to make is to say that I think this is the one part of the world where food does not unite. Food actually divides. Okay? Food helps you stay divided. Because it for you to break through the barrier of the conditioning that eating and not eating something all through your childhood, it takes the amount of effort that you have no business expecting someone to get past that, right? So now I can't expect everyone to say, you know what, you should be able to walk into somebody's house and share a fish curry with them if you grew up vegetarian. How you simply cannot expect that at all, right? And so therefore, I really believe, I think that food, if you want food to unite people, you need to work really, really hard. And it is therefore natural that food divides, and therefore it's a perfect tool for politics. So therefore, food will always be political, right? And again, coming back to sort of beef, and I sort of recall, I grew up at a time when my mother attempted to briefly get one of her uncles who's a priest and so on to teach me Vedas and so on, right? And so apparently our family's Veda is Yajur Veda. And I was studying Sanskrit. I was in high school then, and so therefore, I clearly, I think the guy who was teaching me didn't expect somebody who knew a little bit of Sanskrit vocabulary, right? And so I kind of asked him a question: how come the Yajur Veda has just so many references to sacrificing cows and cattle, and the consumption and eating of cows and cattle? What's going on here? And so on. There was no answer there, right? And so clearly, I think the history of also, I think you have to phrase this entire sort of beef consumption thing through the lens more of the freedom movement rather than anything based in history at all. Okay, the idea of how we came about as to say that there is a Muslim identity where they will not eat pork, and likewise there needs to be a Hindu identity where we will not eat beef because the cow is the mother and so on. And again, you have to remember that society back then, Hindu society particularly, was far more divided by caste. It still continues to be. And the inconvenient truth was the fact that with 30% of the cattle of the world, at some point of time, somebody's got to do something with animals that grow old, right? Cows that stop giving milk, or male cattle, which are 50% of the population. I mean, they're just not going to run around. Why would you waste all those resources? So you have people who are Dalits and so on. There are castes of people who essentially would take those animals away. They would get that's how leather became a thing and so on. They were the poorest of the poor. And they would eat the older cattle. And in a sense, that this is not some net new giant industrial farm. This is basically part of the cycle of you are extracting dairy. You are therefore incentivized to create a huge population of cattle. And then you have a community of people who are happy to eat it because it's the cheapest meat that you can find. But part of what essentially happened during the freedom movement is essentially this fact that you needed to create a pan-Indian identity. And at that point of time, people were too divided. So you had to come up with a few broad rallying calls, right? And it's a very tricky thing because all the people who drove this were largely upper caste men. And so on the one hand, they had a few liberal values. They're like, it's not like we want sati, but we don't want the British to prevent sati. We want to do it on our own terms, right? And so the freedom movement required people to get into these uncomfortable approaches, saying we need a few rallying calls, right? And again, there were many things that were tried. And the whole protection of cow became a very strong rallying call, particularly in the Indo-Gangetic plain. Not so much in the south. Wow. In the Indo-Gangetic plain, and it became and it got people excited about it, and it became the larger part of how was the demonizing the British and being able to get people together, see past their caste and religious identities to be able to sort of band together. Otherwise, it's very, very, very notoriously hard to bring people together in India because with all and so in that sense, I think the politics around beef you're seeing today is really more of a relic of the freedom movement rather than anything set in the past. Although people want to tell you that we've been respecting or not eating cows for ages. That is simply patently not true. Every ancient text, literally every bit of archaeological artifact from the Indus Valley onwards, shows evidence that cattle were consumed, right? In a meaningful way. I mean, obviously nobody wants to kill a cow that's giving you milk, but at the same time, growing old. Remember that these are domesticated animals, right? And we domesticated animals to eat them. That's the fundamental reason we did. Or you have to sit and feed them, right? Or it's not an ecosystem, and I think people need to get comfortable with that.
Yes, that breaks my heart a little bit because this whole idea of Akhand Bharat, and there have been different points that have been picked up in order to either divide or unite people. Yeah. Like you said, it's food, and now I see it being language, and that's a whole other episode in itself, of course. Yeah. But then
food is one of the easiest things to divide people on, because it is very hard to break membership from from something as found
something that sustains you at a very primal level.
as what you
And you take that and divide people with that, that says something.
Yeah.
That says something about how powerful a tool it can be, for sure.
Yeah.
And I sincerely hope that that changes. Again, these are opinions. What is right, what is wrong, again, is up for debate. But I sincerely hope that that changes. And that actually also brings me to my next question for you. And I usually end most of my interviews with this question because this is some word, this is the word that I have been relating to these days, because I feel this country is in the momentum of change. Just humanity in general is in the flux of change. And that word has, and personally also, I'm going through a lot of change as well. So if there is something, Krish, that you would like to change within yourself, or not necessarily within or outside of yourself, what would it be?
I think by having been on the internet for almost 15 years now, and I've sort of seen its evolution from the early days of blogging and small audiences to sort of the general nastiness of political Twitter and so on, and the world in terms of where it is. I think historically my frustration has always been that that we live in a world, and we live particularly in a country with nuance everywhere, meaning that our history is complicated. Nothing is black or white, right? Our heroes are complicated, So we are arguing about whether Nehru was a good or a bad person. No, he was a prime minister, and he had his weaknesses and he had his strengths. And the Gandhi is a good or a bad person, or Aurangzeb is a good or a bad person. And I think we live in a country where, and we also live in a country where we constantly, you just have to take any bit of scripture to find some of the most stunningly insightful things and some of the most stunningly bigoted and downright dangerous things. And all of these kind of coexist, right? And you and in the country filled with so much nuance, what has always been, I have personally struggled with the fact that the vast majority of people are binary thinkers, in the sense that, is this good or bad? Is it healthy or unhealthy? Is this person a terrorist, not a terrorist, right? It is in a sense that, is this cruel? Is it cruel to eat animals, or is it kind to not eat animals, and so on? So people like dealing in binaries, and in a world where you just have to open your eyes, and there's nuance and shades of gray everywhere, right? A million shades of gray everywhere. So in a sense, I think if there's anything I'd like to change in myself is if there's any way I can communicate nuance in a way that doesn't challenge people's intelligence. Right?
Do you struggle with that?
Yeah. Doesn't challenge.
Is that a problem in conversations?
Yeah, I know.
Communicating nuances or having a discussion about that. Yeah.
I wish I could explain nuance to people without coming across as the sort of cowardly fence sitter, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And that's how it's seen, right? You're not taking a side. You're forever, no matter what I say, you're forever trying to sort of sit in the middle. I'm not interested in sitting on the fence, because sitting on the fence essentially means that you are above and you're looking down on both extremes. I would rather tear down the fence, stand in the middle, and bring those ideas together and say, "Hey, look, I think everything is complicated." And I honestly, I've still yet to figure out how to do that, and I wish I can.
This is so relatable to me, Krish, because I think that was my inspiration for having this conversation as well. Because I think culture as a subject can be very, very nuanced, and I think whenever I tell people what I do for a living, even it usually precedes a monologue. And that's what mostly the discussion ends with, that there's no, first of all, right or wrong in culture, like there's no right or wrong in food. It's the nuances and the differences and the similarities that people need to see. And I think that definitely happens through conversation. And you today, I think, opened up so many topics there, right from casteism, right from women in the kitchen, right from how, a pav bhaji is not necessarily an Indian dish, which is going to be shocking to many. So I think those conversations and people like you talking about it is very necessary. But I believe that you do do speak about nuances with a lot of grace, if anything else. So thank you so much, Krish, for doing this.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being part of Intercultural Conversations. And if you wish, you could also share your socials or where people can find your book before we leave.
Well, socials is Krish Ashok on Twitter. Masala_Masala Lab on Instagram. Apparently, the original Masala Lab is taken by some spice company that has a defunct handle. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And books, Masala Lab, The Science of Indian Cooking. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Krish, and have a great evening. And thank you everybody who joined and who are still here. Thank you for participating and commenting as well. And yes, Krish is amazing. And it's hugely informative. I'm seeing all of the comments. You have a huge fan base, Krish.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.